A faded photo unlocks a hidden past. But who is the man in the ICU? And why does he have it?
Welcome to Whispered Truth, where touching stories come alive. Let's jump into today's story.
The fluorescent lights of the emergency room buzzed, a monotonous soundtrack to Emily Carter's Friday night. She sipped lukewarm coffee, the paper cup sweating in her hand, and glanced at the clock. 2:17 a.m. Another couple of hours until the next shift mercifully arrived. The low hum of the hospital was a familiar comfort. It was the human element, unpredictable and often heartbreaking, that kept her on edge. A sudden flurry of activity near the ambulance bay broke the spell. Emily watched as paramedics wheeled in a gurney, an elderly man lying still beneath a thin blanket. His face was pale, almost translucent, framed by a halo of wispy white hair. He was unconscious, unresponsive. "A known male found near the old train tracks," one of the paramedics said, his voice tight with concern. "No ID, no phone. Looks like a possible stroke." Emily took a deep breath, a practiced calm settling over her. This was her domain, the chaos and the quiet desperation. She approached the gurney as they pushed him into Bay 3. The usual assessment began. Blood pressure was low, irregular pulse. The monitors beeped a hesitant rhythm, mirroring the frail life they struggled to support. Emily worked efficiently, her fingers moving with a precision honed by years of practice. She inserted in 4, her touch gentle despite the urgency. "We need a CT, stat," she instructed, her voice calm yet firm. The resident nodded, already on his phone. The man's breathing was shallow, each inhale a labored whisper. He looked fragile, like a dried leaf about to crumble into dust. Emily felt a pang of empathy, a familiar ache in her chest that came with seeing someone so close to the edge. She always wondered about the lives of the people who came through these doors, the stories etched onto their faces and bodies. What had led him here, to this lonely corner of the earth at this hour of the night? She glanced at his hands, gnarled and calloused, the skin thin and papery. There were traces of dirt beneath his fingernails. He had been living rough. She made a mental note. After the CT was done, the resident read the report. "Massive bled, subarachnoid," he stated. "We need to get him to neuro ASAP. It doesn't look good." It wouldn't be the first time Emily had to deal with a dying patient, but there was something about this man, the vulnerability etched on his face, that tugged at her. As they prepped him for the transfer, Emily found herself smoothing a loose strand of hair from his forehead. It was a small gesture, but it felt important. A moment of simple human connection amidst the sterile beats and frantic activity. She noticed a small, almost invisible bulge in the man's trouser pocket. She retrieved a crumpled piece of paper, pulling it gently out of the material. It was an old photograph, faded and creased, as if it had been carried for a long time. Emily's breath hitched. It was her, standing on the steps of the hospital, the day she graduated nursing school. She was smiling, radiant with the promise of her future, her graduation gown billowing in the breeze. Next to her, his arm around her shoulders, was Dr. James Parker. Her mentor, a renowned surgeon who'd been disgraced and vanished almost 2 decades ago. Her heart pounded. Her mentor, with his kind eyes and gentle smile. The man who had believed in her when no one else did. The man who had been taken from her. The image of Dr. Parker hit her like a punch to the gut. A wave of dizziness washed over her, threatening to pull her under the surface. She looked from the photograph to the man on the bed, his face still and peaceful. How could this man have a picture of her from so many years ago with Dr. Parker? What could the connection be? A tremor of fear went through her, cold and sharp. She slipped the photo into the pocket of her scrubs, her fingers trembling. She couldn't risk it being seen. The neuro team arrived, their faces grave. The man's fate was no longer in Emily's hands. Still, she found herself staying by his side as he was wheeled out of the air, towards the operating room and his possible doom. An irrational feeling had taken hold of her, an idea that she could somehow help this man, even though she knew it was completely illogical. She followed the procession down the hall, her gaze fixed on the man's still form, the photograph burning a hole in her pocket. The weight of the photo was immense. This was not just a simple medical emergency. It felt like a message, a cryptic clue from her past. She knew that whatever she had found, whatever was happening, would change her life. And she felt completely alone. The fluorescent lights above flickered. Emily's shift ended, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. The photograph, a tangible piece of her past, was a magnet, pulling her back into the vortex of memories she'd tried so hard to bury. The hospital cafeteria was mostly empty at this hour, the air heavy with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. She sat at a corner table, the photograph lying face down on the sticky surface. The image of Dr. Parker, a ghost from a life she thought she'd left behind, was too potent to ignore. 20 years. It felt like a lifetime ago, yet the memory of him was as vivid as if it were yesterday. His booming laugh echoing through the surgical wing, the way his brow furrowed when he was concentrating, the quiet encouragement he offered when she doubted herself. He was more than just a mentor. He was a father figure, a guiding light in her often turbulent life. She closed her eyes, the past washing over her in a tide of bittersweet nostalgia. She remembered her first day in his surgical rotation. She was terrified, intimidated by the sheer scale of the responsibility, by the weight of life and death that hung over the operating room. Dr. Parker had seen her fear. He'd placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle for such a large man. "Emily," he'd said, his voice calm and reassuring. "You have the talent, the drive, and the compassion to be a truly great surgeon. Don't let fear hold you back." His belief in her had been the wind beneath her wings. He taught her not just surgical skills, but the importance of empathy, of treating each patient as an individual, not just a case study. He instilled in her the values that she still held sacred. But the respect and admiration she'd held for him had crumbled in one spectacular fall, a public disgrace. It was a scandal that had rocked the hospital, the city, her entire world. Accusations of malpractice, falsified records, gross negligence. The details were hazy now, shrouded in the fog of time, and the deliberate act of forgetting. The media circus, the whispers, the stares, the devastation was overwhelming. The accusations had been devastating to her. She had struggled to get through each day at the hospital. People were suspicious of her, whispering behind her back. They thought that because she was his protege, she was implicated in his actions. Emily could still see the headlines in the local papers. Local surgeon scandal, Dr. Parker removed from practice pending investigation. It felt like a punch in the face. They had tried to contact him, but she had been told he was not available. The hospital had then moved to fire him, and he was gone. The speed with which it happened was still a blur for her. He was a hero one day, a criminal the next. She opened her eyes and took another sip of her now cold coffee. She had tried to defend him, but it was no use. No one wanted to hear what she had to say. He was guilty in the eyes of everyone, and Emily had been collateral damage. He had been stripped of everything, his job, his reputation, and his legacy. He had simply vanished into the ether, and she had no idea what had happened to him. Until now. Emily took out the photograph again and traced Dr. Parker's smiling face. The youthful confidence, the glint in his eyes, it was almost unbearable to see, knowing how his life had been destroyed. This man in Bay 3, this stranger, held the key to her past. He held the key to the mystery of Dr. Parker's disappearance. Why did he have this photograph? What was his connection to a man who had been a complete pariah for 2 decades? She took out her phone and took a picture of the photograph. She needed to see if she could get a date from the digital image. If she could find a date from the photo, she could see if there were more photos in the newspaper archives from that day. A sudden urge to find out the truth came over her, an overwhelming desire to set the record straight, to clear the name of the man who had meant so much to her. It was foolish, reckless perhaps, to delve into a past that was best left undisturbed, but she couldn't ignore the pull. This feeling that she was on the verge of uncovering something significant, something that would change everything. She had not spoken of him in years, and had worked hard to forget him. But it was as if she was being pulled back in by invisible strings of fate. She made a mental note to start her investigation. She would first find out as much as she could about the man in Bay 3. She would then try to find any information about the scandal that had rocked the hospital. She would find out the truth about Dr. Parker. She also needed to find out more about the man in the hospital room, his reason for having the photo, and his connection to Dr. Parker. There was no way the photo was a coincidence. Someone knew how important Dr. Parker was to her. She tucked the photograph back into her scrub pocket, a renewed sense of purpose hardening her gaze. The familiar hum of the hospital seemed different now, no longer a comfort, but a constant reminder of the secrets held within its walls. She got up, throwing away the empty cup. She needed to go check on the patient in neuro, to see if there were any changes, to keep him alive if she could. He was the only key she had to finding Dr. Parker, her one way to finally know what happened to him. Emily stepped out of the cafeteria and headed to the neuro ward. She had to know the truth, whatever the cost. As she walked, her mind raced, putting the pieces of this puzzle together.
Wait! Sorry to interrupt you, but please subscribe to our channel Whispered Truth and reach the goal of 1,000 subscribers. Your subscribe and like helps us a lot, and comment your favorite part. Now let's get back to the story.
The neuro-intensive care unit was a hushed, dimly lit space, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and the low thrum of life support machines. Emily approached the nurse's station, her gaze immediately drawn to the monitors displaying the man's vital signs. They were stable for now. The nurse on duty, a young woman named Sarah, looked up with tired eyes. "He's holding steady," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. But the neurosurgeons aren't optimistic. They said the bleed was extensive. He's still unconscious. Emily nodded, the weight of the man's precarious condition pressing down on her. He was a vessel, carrying the secrets of her past, and his fragile hold on life was a constant threat to her hopes of finding answers. "Has he been identified yet?" Emily asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Sarah shook her head. "Nothing, no wallet, no phone, no family contacts. He's a complete unknown." Emily felt a jolt of frustration. Each passing moment, the man remained a cipher, and his silence made the picture even more unclear. She spent the next hour by the man's bedside, watching him, searching for any sign of recognition, any clue that might unlock the mystery of his identity. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. There was a network of wrinkles around his eyes and mouth, deep lines that spoke of a life lived hard, a life marked by hardship. Emily wondered if he was aware of her presence, if he could sense the silent conversation happening around him. She took out the photograph again, the image of her and Dr. Parker, a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the ICU. She studied his face, comparing it to the photograph. There wasn't a clear resemblance, but there was something in his eyes that reminded her of Dr. Parker's. It was a fleeting familiarity that she couldn't quite grasp. Maybe she was just seeing what she wanted to see. She put the picture away and tried to clear her head. She needed to think rationally. She decided to start her investigation with finding anything in the hospital archives about Dr. Parker. Emily left the ICU and went down to the basement of the hospital where the old hospital archives were stored. The room was cold and dusty, the air heavy with the smell of old paper and forgotten memories. Row after row of filing cabinets stretched out before her, each one filled with the records of patients and staff who had passed through the hospital over the years. She pulled out the file for Dr. Parker. The file was thick, filled with documents, reports, and letters related to the scandal that had led to his dismissal. She went through each document, her heart sinking at every detail. The accusations were brutal, painting him as a man who was not only incompetent, but also unethical. There were reports from patients detailing surgical errors and medical negligence. There were allegations of falsified medical records and mishandling of patient data. She started to feel a sense of dread. She started to feel sick to her stomach, but she continued to read. The documents seemed damning, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that there were missing pieces to the puzzle. She noticed inconsistencies in the reports, small details that didn't quite add up. She found one report that had been altered, the ink slightly different, the writing style inconsistent with the original. This wasn't right. It was as if someone was trying to frame Dr. Parker, but why? And who? As she went deeper into the archive, a pattern emerged. Each report was more damning than the last, with the inconsistencies piling up. It was clear this was not just human error. The accusations were too perfect, too strategically placed. Someone had been working hard to make him appear guilty. The deeper she went, the more uneasy she felt. She decided to look for the original patient files, to see if the issues reported matched the original records. She was convinced now that someone was responsible for framing him, and she was determined to find out who. She found the relevant patient files and was shocked by what she found. There were clear discrepancies between the original records and the reports filed later. The original records indicated no issues, but the altered reports had portrayed gross medical negligence. Emily was appalled at the extent of the deception. Someone was very powerful and had influence over the hospital staff. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure Dr. Parker's downfall. As she was packing away the files, she noticed a name on one of the reports, a name that she recognized but couldn't place. Dr. Richard Thompson. She ran a quick search on the hospital records. Dr. Thompson was the chief of surgery, the one who had taken Dr. Parker's place, the one who had benefited from his demise. A cold feeling went down Emily's spine. Could Dr. Thompson be responsible for framing Dr. Parker? The thought was chilling, a possibility that she couldn't ignore. He was an ambitious man, known for his ruthlessness. It seemed highly plausible that he had been involved in framing Dr. Parker. She left the archives feeling numb. The truth was more complex, more sinister than she had ever imagined. She needed to find more evidence. She needed to find out more about Dr. Thompson. It was as if a new layer of the mystery had been revealed. She was no longer just investigating the man in the ICU. She was investigating a cover-up. She had a mission now, to clear Dr. Parker's name. She had to uncover the truth, no matter how dangerous it was, and she had to do it before it was too late. Emily decided to go back to the ICU to check on the man. As she walked through the hospital, she felt as if she was being watched, a feeling that she wasn't alone. The corridors seemed darker, the shadows longer, the secrets deeper. The hospital was hiding something, and she was determined to uncover it. When she arrived at the ICU, Sarah looked grave. "I'm sorry," she said. "He's gone." Emily's world tilted. The key to her past, to Dr. Parker, was now gone. The news of the man's death hit Emily with a force that surprised her. It was a strange mix of grief and frustration. Grief for a life lost, for a connection that had been severed before it could truly form, and frustration at the loss of her only lead, the potential link to Dr. Parker. The hospital seemed to close in on her, the walls vibrating with the echoes of what could have been. She needed to act quickly now, before any evidence was removed or destroyed. She went into the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face, trying to calm the panic that was threatening to overwhelm her. She knew that she needed to be strategic now and think clearly. She took out her phone and looked at the photograph again, a cold rage building inside her. She would not let what happened to Dr. Parker remain a secret. Someone needed to be held accountable. Emily's immediate priority was to learn more about Dr. Richard Thompson, the man who had benefited most from Dr. Parker's downfall. She started by looking up his hospital records, his staff profile. The records portrayed him as a highly skilled surgeon, a leader in his field, with a spotless record. But she knew that this was not the full story. It was a carefully constructed facade, hiding the ambition and ruthlessness that lay beneath the surface. She found a list of his publications, which included medical journals, research papers, and medical reviews. Emily decided to start looking through these documents to see if she could find any hint of wrongdoing or anything that could connect him to the scandal that had ended Dr. Parker's career. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack, but she knew she needed to start somewhere. She spent the rest of her shift in the hospital library, poring over journals and medical texts. She was determined to find something, some piece of evidence, anything, that could implicate him in the cover-up. She printed off a series of his published work and took it home with her. Emily's apartment, usually a haven of calm, was now a battleground. The table was littered with papers, medical journals, and files. She had created a timeline of Dr. Parker's dismissal, cross-referencing his case with those of Dr. Thompson's to see if she could find any connections. She paced the room, her mind racing, piecing together the puzzle, trying to find the pattern. She decided to focus on Dr. Thompson's surgical record. She had access to the hospital database, so she started to go through his case files. As she worked, she started to notice similarities to what had happened to Dr. Parker. There were inconsistencies in some of his reports, similar to what she had found in the archives. The same pattern of altered records, the same discrepancies in medical details, but not as prominent as with Dr. Parker's files. He was covering his tracks well. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Dr. Thompson was not just a beneficiary of Dr. Parker's disgrace, he was likely the one who had orchestrated it. He was using the same method, the same playbook, but he was being more careful, less obvious. He was slowly taking down his colleagues to get ahead, just like he had done with Dr. Parker. Emily had to figure out why he had done this, what his motive had been. There had to be more to it than just ambition. There had to be some kind of personal vendetta. She poured through the files, looking for a connection between the two men. She found some old personnel files that indicated that the two men had been rivals for a prestigious position. This rivalry had been intense, and it was likely that Dr. Thompson had seen Dr. Parker as a threat to his own career. That made sense. He was a jealous man, desperate for fame and recognition. He couldn't live in someone else's shadow. She needed to find concrete evidence if she was to bring him down. She knew that she couldn't take her findings to the hospital administration. They were too close to Thompson, too easily swayed by his reputation, too easily bought. She needed to go to the police, to find someone she could trust. As she sat staring at the mountain of paperwork, her phone rang. It was an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment, and then answered. "Hello," she said, her voice tight with apprehension. A distorted voice on the other end spoke. "We know what you're doing, Emily. Stop digging, or you'll regret it." The line went dead. Emily's heart pounded, her blood running cold. Someone was watching her. Someone knew about her investigation. She was no longer just looking into a past scandal. She was caught up in a conspiracy, a web of deceit that was far more dangerous than she had realized. A wave of fear washed over her. This was bigger than her now. There was a group of people involved. and they wanted to keep her quiet. She felt completely alone and isolated. She was terrified, but also completely enraged. They had threatened her, and this had changed everything. Emily decided to reach out to an old friend of hers, a former detective who had left the force after becoming disillusioned with the system. She needed someone who could help her navigate this treacherous territory, someone who wouldn't be intimidated by the forces at play. She had always trusted him. She called him and explained what had happened, not going into too much detail. "I need your help," she said. "I'm in danger." He agreed to meet her. She grabbed her coat and the files that she had been working on. She knew that she needed to be careful now. Someone had made it clear they did not want her to find out the truth. And that made Emily even more determined to bring them down. She had one goal, and nothing would stop her. Emily grabbed her keys and left the apartment. She could hear the footsteps behind her. She started to run. Emily met her friend, Detective Mark Olson, at a dimly lit bar on the edge of the city. The atmosphere was heavy with the scent of stale beer and desperation, a fitting backdrop for the secrets she was about to share. Mark, with his weathered face and cynical gaze, listened intently as Emily laid out her findings, the evidence of Dr. Thompson's deception, the threat she had received, the murder of the man in the ICU. His expression remained impassive, but Emily could sense the wheels turning in his mind. "This is not just a hospital scandal anymore, Emily. This is a conspiracy, and it's going to be dangerous," he said, his voice low and serious. "You stumbled into something big." Emily nodded, her fear tempered by a steely resolve. She knew the risks, but she couldn't back down now. She had come too far, and she was not going to let them silence her. She had a responsibility to Dr. Parker, a duty to the truth. Mark had been a good detective, until he had become too disillusioned with the corruption and politics of the police force. He had left the force to start a small private investigations company and had taken a lot of cases that the police wouldn't. He agreed that what she had uncovered was significant and that Dr. Thompson was likely involved in something illegal, not only professionally, but criminally. They spent the next few hours strategizing, going over the evidence, looking for a way to expose Dr. Thompson and bring him to justice. Mark agreed to use his connections to get the police involved, but they needed more concrete evidence, something that would convince the authorities of their claims. He looked at the photo Emily had found. "This is your guy's Link, I think," he said, pointing to the man in the picture. There was something on the local news about an unidentified man found near the train tracks. The description matches this guy. Maybe he had information. Maybe he was a witness, and they killed him before he could tell anyone. Someone wanted him silenced. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The man had been murdered, not for the reasons she had thought, but because he had known the truth about Dr. Parker and Dr. Thompson. The pieces were starting to come together now, the puzzle taking shape. She needed to find out who the man was and how he was connected to Dr. Parker and Thompson. Mark told her that he was going to use his contacts to find out any information he could about the man in the picture, while Emily went back to the hospital to try to find any further evidence against Thompson. He reminded her to be careful, that she was in danger. She left the bar and went back to the hospital. She knew that she needed to be as careful as possible. The hospital felt different now, more sinister, more threatening. She walked through the dimly lit corridors, each shadow seeming to hold a potential threat. She went to the records office, hoping to find more clues, some small piece of evidence that would help her. She searched through the hospital database, looking for any information about the man in the ICU. She found his records under unknown male. There was not much there except his date of birth and that he had been in and out of the hospital multiple times. He had no next of kin. But there was a note on the bottom of the file. It was a request for his records to be sent to Dr. Thompson's office, a request that had been made the day he had been found. Why did Dr. Thompson need his records? Was the man an informant? Did Thompson fear him? Her suspicions that the man had been murdered were confirmed. Dr. Thompson had ordered the records to be sent to him because he was worried that the man knew the truth about him and Dr. Parker, and because he was trying to cover his tracks. Emily was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how dangerous it was. She walked to Thompson's office and found a key under his desk. She entered the office. She was alone. She started to look around. She needed to find something to expose him. She looked through his desk. Nothing. She looked through the bookshelves. Nothing. As she was about to leave, she noticed the wall was slightly loose. She pulled it and found a small secret compartment. It was filled with papers and records, files on his patients and colleagues. She looked at the files and found the proof that she had been looking for. A file with a list of names of people he had paid off, people who had helped him to cover up his mistakes and orchestrate the downfall of his rivals. Dr. Parker's name was on there, and so was the man who had died in the ICU. The evidence was damning. Thompson had been working hard to destroy anyone who stood in his way. As Emily was putting the files away, Thompson walked in. "What do you think you're doing?" he said, his face a mask of rage. "I know what you have done," Emily said, her voice shaking but firm. "You are a monster, and I will make sure everyone knows the truth. You tried to destroy Dr. Parker, and you killed the man in ICU because you were afraid he would tell the truth." Thompson lunged at her, but she managed to dodge him. She managed to pull out her phone and call the police. The police arrived and arrested Thompson. The investigation into Dr. Thompson's activities started, and the media went into overdrive. The local papers were full of the accusations, the cover-ups, and the conspiracy. The scandal reached the national news, with everyone calling for Thompson to be held to account. Emily's evidence was solid, and Thompson was indicted. He was eventually convicted of the crimes that he had committed and stripped of his license. She had finally managed to expose the truth behind Dr. Parker's disgrace and the truth behind the man in the ICU. It had come at a cost, but she was finally able to clear Dr. Parker's name and honor his memory. A few weeks later, Emily stood at the graveside of Dr. Parker, a quiet sadness in her eyes, but a sense of peace in her heart. It was time for her to finally start to heal. It was time for her to move on. She would never forget what had happened, but she knew that she had done the right thing. She looked up at the sky. She knew that Dr. Parker would have been proud of her.
Hey, want to listen to another best story? Then click the floating video and subscribe for more.